She had just finished a 12-hour night shift when flashing lights pinned her at the gas pump. Cold Montana air, an empty highway stretching into darkness. 2 police cruisers, no sirens, just smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "Step out of the car," one officer said, calm and deliberate. The handcuffs clicked shut before she could ask why. A dim license light, they claimed. Minutes dragged on. Voices dropped lower. The questions stopped sounding official. A few cars sat nearby, engines running, drivers watching from behind fogged windshields. No one stepping out, no one interfering. This was how it ended most nights. Quiet, unnoticed. Then the convenience store door opened. A former U.S. Marine stepped into the light, and beside him stood a German Shepherd canine, perfectly still, eyes locked on the scene. In that second, the night shifted. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, subscribe so you don't miss stories of courage, redemption, and quiet miracles. Winter pressed down on Redwood Falls like a heavy hand, the cold settling into the asphalt and steel of a nearly deserted highway gas station, where fluorescent lights buzzed against the silence just before midnight. Maya Johnson eased her sedan to a stop beside pump number 3 and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet rang in her ears. At 28, she had learned to treasure silence after 12-hour night shifts, but tonight, the stillness felt uneasy, stretched too thin. She stepped out of the car, pulling her coat tighter around her slim frame. Maya was of average height, her build lean from long hospital hours spent on her feet. Her dark brown skin held the faint sheen of exhaustion, and her tightly curled black hair was pulled into a low bun that had begun to loosen. Her face, soft around the eyes, sharper at the jaw, carried the calm professionalism of a woman used to keeping fear hidden behind courtesy. Working as a nurse had taught her that panic never helped anyone, least of all herself. She slid her card into the pump and waited, watching her breath bloom white in the cold air. The station sat alone at the edge of town, bordered by snow-dusted fields and a stretch of highway that funneled truckers through Redwood Falls without ever inviting them to stay. Maya liked this stop normally. It was quiet, predictable. Tonight, predictability vanished the moment red and blue lights washed across the concrete. 2 patrol cars rolled in from opposite ends of the lot, lights flashing but sirens silent. Maya froze for half a second, then forced herself to keep moving, eyes forward, hands visible. One car stopped behind her sedan, the other angled in from the side, a practiced formation that made her stomach tighten. She had done nothing wrong, she knew that, but knowledge didn't slow her pulse. Officer Blake Harris stepped out first. He was in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a square face that looked permanently set in mild irritation. A trimmed beard traced his jaw, and his eyes, pale under the brim of his cap, scanned Maya with detached scrutiny rather than interest. He moved with the confidence of someone rarely questioned. His partner, Officer Tom Keller, followed more slowly. Keller was shorter, stockier, with a flushed face and thinning blonde hair visible beneath his hat. Where Harris was controlled, Keller radiated impatience, his jaw working as if chewing on something sour. "Evening, ma'am," Harris said, voice flat. "License and registration?" Maya nodded, setting the pump handle back into place before reaching slowly into her car. "Of course, officer." Her voice stayed steady, though her heart hammered hard enough to feel in her throat. She handed over the documents with both hands. "May I ask what this is about?" Harris glanced toward the rear of her car. "Your license plate light's flickering. Hard to read from the road." Maya followed his gaze. She knew the light worked. She had checked the car that morning out of habit, a small ritual born from years of learning how easily small things could be turned into problems. "I believe it's functioning properly, but I'm happy to check with you." "Stay where you are," Keller cut in, his tone sharp. "We'll handle it." Harris took the documents back to his patrol car. The minutes stretched. 5 turned into 10, then 20. Maya stood beside her car, hands clasped in front of her, acutely aware of how alone she was. The gas station attendant was nowhere in sight, and the highway remained empty, as if the world had decided to look away. Keller leaned against his cruiser, watching her openly now, his eyes lingering just a second too long. The cold seeped through her boots, numbing her toes, but she didn't move. Her thoughts began to spiral despite her efforts. She thought of the patients she had left behind at the hospital, of the steady rhythm of monitors and the illusion of control that place provided. Out here, under flashing lights, control belonged to someone else. She reminded herself to breathe slowly, evenly. Politeness, she knew, could be a shield, thin but sometimes effective. After nearly 40 minutes, Harris returned, but not alone. Keller straightened as a third figure appeared, not another officer, but a man stepping out from the shadows beyond the glass doors of the small grocery attached to the station. The door swung open with a muted chime, spilling warm yellow light onto the pavement. The man paused just outside the threshold. He was in his early 40s, tall, with a solid, squared build that spoke of strength maintained rather than flaunted. His hair was dark, with streaks of gray at the temples, cut short in a way that suggested old habits. A rough stubble covered his jaw, framing a mouth set in a neutral line. His eyes, deep-set and alert, took in the scene in a single sweep. Patrol cars, officers, a lone woman beside her car. There was no surprise in his expression, only assessment. At his heels stood a German shepherd, large and powerfully built, coat a mix of black and tan that caught the station light in sharp contrast. The dog did not bark. He did not pull. He simply stood, ears forward, body perfectly still, gaze locked on the officers with an intensity that made the air feel suddenly tighter. The dog looked to be about 7 years old, mature and disciplined, the kind of animal shaped by training and experience rather than instinct alone. The man rested one hand lightly on the dog's collar. "Everything all right out here?" he asked, his voice calm, even, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being heard without raising it. Harris turned, irritation flashing across his face. Keller muttered something under his breath. Maya felt the shift immediately, the way the balance of the night tilted, subtle but undeniable. For the first time since the lights had come on, she wasn't the only one being watched. The man met Harris's stare without blinking. Behind him, the German shepherd remained motionless, a silent presence that changed the space between them. The cold seemed to recede, replaced by a different kind of tension, heavier and far less familiar. And just like that, the night was no longer moving in only one direction. Ethan Walker did not step fully into the cold at first. He remained just beyond the doorway of the small grocery attached to the station, one hand resting on the doorframe, the other lightly gripping the worn leather collar of the German shepherd at his side. The fluorescent light from inside cast sharp angles across his face, emphasizing the hard lines of his cheekbones and the faint scar that cut through his right eyebrow, a souvenir from a life he no longer talked about. At 42, Ethan carried himself with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that unnecessary movement invited trouble. He wore a dark canvas jacket over a faded flannel shirt, the kind of clothing chosen for durability, not appearance. His posture was relaxed but grounded, feet planted evenly, shoulders squared. This was a man who had once learned how to stand his ground when standing still was the only option left. Beside him, Rex remained silent. The German shepherd's coat was thick and well kept, black saddle contrasting sharply with tan legs and chest. His muzzle had begun to gray slightly around the edges, marking him as older, 7, maybe 8. But his eyes were clear and alert, tracking every movement with disciplined focus. Rex's body language was controlled, professional, as if waiting for a command that might never come. He did not bare his teeth or lower his head. He simply watched. Ethan's gaze moved from Officer Harris to Officer Keller and then to Maya. He took in her rigid posture, the way her hands were clasped too tightly in front of her, the effort she was making to look calm. He had seen that look before, on civilians overseas, on young recruits back home, on people who knew they were being pushed but didn't know how far it might go. "She's a customer," Ethan said calmly, his voice low and even. "She stopped to get gas, that's all." Officer Harris turned fully toward him now, irritation etched plainly across his face. "This is a traffic stop," he said. "Doesn't concern you." Ethan nodded once, as if acknowledging a point rather than conceding it. "It concerns me when it happens on my property," he replied, "and when it keeps a customer here for nearly an hour." Keller snorted, pushing himself off the hood of his cruiser. "You accusing us of something?" Ethan met his eyes without flinching. "I'm asking what's taking so long." The cold air seems to sharpen between them. Maya felt it immediately, that shift in pressure that came when people stopped pretending to be polite. She wanted to speak, to say something that might diffuse the moment, but her throat tightened. Every instinct told her not to interrupt. She had learned, painfully, that inserting herself often made things worse. Rex shifted his weight slightly, paws adjusting on the concrete, but he remained where he was. His ears stayed forward, his tail neutral. Ethan's hand did not tighten on the collar. If anything, it loosened, a quiet signal of trust. "Rex," he murmured, not as a command, but as a reminder. The dog did not look at him. He didn't need to. Officer Harris stepped closer to Ethan, closing the distance deliberately. "You need to go back inside," he said. "You're interfering." Ethan tilted his head a fraction, studying Harris now the way one might study a cracked beam, assessing how much weight it could still carry. "I haven't interfered," he said. "I haven't told you what to do. I've just been standing here." Keller laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You and your dog." Ethan's eyes flicked briefly to Rex, then back to Keller. "He's trained," he said simply, "and under my control." Maya noticed something then, how Keller's confidence faltered just a touch, how his gaze lingered on the dog before snapping back to Ethan's face. It wasn't fear exactly, but calculation. The kind that came when a situation stopped being predictable. Ethan gestured casually toward the pole-mounted cameras that overlooked the pumps. "Everything out here's recorded," he added, "audio and video. Been that way for years." Harris's jaw tightened. For a split second, something unreadable crossed his face before he smoothed it away. "We're not worried about your cameras." That was when Keller smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was thin and knowing, the kind worn by someone who believed they were untouchable. "Yeah," he said, glancing up at the cameras and then back at Ethan. "We're familiar with them." The words landed heavier than they should have. Ethan did not react outwardly, but inside, a quiet alarm bell rang. Familiar how? He wondered. The thought came unbidden, followed by others he did not like. Complaints that went nowhere. Customers who stopped coming for a while and never explained why. The uneasy feeling that sometimes settled in his gut when patrol cars lingered longer than necessary. Maya felt it too, the implications slipping under her skin like cold water. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a one-off. Her chest tightened as the realization took shape. Whatever was happening to her tonight had happened here before. Ethan's voice remained steady, but there was a new edge beneath it. "If you're familiar with my cameras," he said, "then you know they don't miss much." Harris took a step back, eyes narrowing. "You're pushing it." Ethan shrugged slightly. "I'm standing where I'm allowed to stand." For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the station lights filled the silence, joined by the distant rush of a truck passing on the highway. Rex stood like a statue, a living boundary drawn in muscle and fur. Maya realized with a mix of fear and fragile hope that the night had shifted again. Not toward safety, not yet, but toward something less certain for the men in uniform. And uncertainty, she sensed, was not a space they liked to occupy. Officer Harris shifted his weight and glanced toward Maya's car, then back at her face. "Step out of the vehicle area," he said, voice clipped. "We need to run a few more checks." It was phrased as procedure, but there was no paperwork in his hands, no device waiting to be used. Maya felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She had already stepped out once. She was already standing in the cold. The request wasn't about location, it was about compliance. She obeyed anyway. Maya moved slowly, deliberately, boots crunching softly against the thin layer of ice forming on the concrete. She kept her hands visible, fingers numb, heart racing. Up close, Harris smelled faintly of coffee and cold metal. His face was impassive, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan and then back to her, calculating. Keller circled a few steps behind, close enough that Maya could feel his presence at her back, crowding her space without touching. It made her shoulders tense, instincts screaming even as her mind told her to stay calm. Years in the emergency room had taught her how quickly authority could become dangerous when mixed with impatience. Ethan took one step forward. It wasn't aggressive, but it was unmistakable. His voice dropped, firm now, stripped of its earlier neutrality. "She's already cooperated," he said. "There's no reason for you to move her again." The words were measured, but the tone carried weight. The kind that came from someone who had learned the cost of hesitation. Rex adjusted with him, moving just enough to remain aligned at Ethan's left side. The German shepherd's body angled subtly toward Maya, broad chest forming a quiet barrier. His ears stayed forward, eyes alert, every muscle engaged, yet restrained. At his age, closer to 8 now than 7, Rex had learned the difference between threat and noise. He did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. His presence alone was a statement. Someone was watching, and someone was ready. Keller scoffed. "You gonna tell us how to do our job now?" he said, his voice edged with mockery. He was flushed from the cold, or perhaps from something else, his breath visible in short bursts. Keller had the look of a man who had spent years relying on uniform and badge to fill gaps where patience should have been. His thinning hair peeked from beneath his cap, and his jaw worked constantly, as if chewing down frustration. "I'm telling you to keep your distance," Ethan replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You're escalating something that doesn't need it." Maya felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief that someone was speaking up. Fear that speaking up might make things worse. She stood frozen between them, aware of how exposed she was, aware too of how easily the situation could tilt. She wondered if anyone else was watching, if anyone cared. The night air seemed to swallow sound, leaving only the hum of lights and the low idle of engines. Then, headlights appeared at the edge of the lot. A pickup slowed, then another car behind it. They didn't pull in fully, but they didn't leave either. Drivers craned their necks, curiosity overcoming caution. One man stepped out of his truck near the highway edge, tall and bundled in a heavy parka, phone already in his hand, as if debating whether to record. A woman remained seated in a sedan farther back, her face pale in the glow of her dashboard, eyes fixed on the scene. The presence of witnesses changed the air again, subtle but real. Harris noticed too. His jaw tightened, and his hand hovered near his radio. "Ma'am," he said to Maya, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're just doing our job." Maya nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. Her thoughts raced. She thought of her mother's voice, of warnings given and repeated. Be polite. Don't argue. Get home safe. She swallowed hard, reminding herself to breathe. If she panicked now, she would give them something to use. Ethan's gaze flicked toward the onlookers, then back to Harris. There are people watching now, he said quietly. Let's keep this professional. For a brief moment, it seemed Harris might back down. His shoulders shifted, uncertainty flickering. Then Keller leaned closer and muttered something too low for Maya to hear. Harris's eyes hardened. He turned slightly away from the group and brought his radio up near his mouth. Dispatch, he said under his breath. Send another unit. Ethan caught the movement immediately. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but recognition. He had seen this before, the way authority doubled down when challenged, the way numbers were used to restore dominance. Rex stiffened a fraction, sensing the change in Ethan's posture. Ethan's hand rested calmly at the dog's neck, fingers pressing just enough to reassure without restraining. Keller leaned in toward Harris, his voice barely audible but sharp in the stillness. Careful, he whispered. That guy's not just some clerk. Heard about him. Former Marine. The words hung there, thin but loaded. Harris's eyes flicked back to Ethan, reassessing him not as a nuisance, but as a variable. The realization did not soften his stance, it complicated it. Maya saw it plainly now, the shift from dismissal to calculation. Whatever power the badge held here, it had just encountered something it did not fully understand. Ethan met Harris's stare, unblinking. He did not confirm or deny the whisper. He didn't need to. The past he carried was etched into the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way his dog remained perfectly still beside him. He had survived situations where authority meant nothing and discipline meant everything. As the radio crackled softly at Harris's shoulder, Maya felt the night stretch further, tension coiling tighter. The stop was no longer routine. It was becoming something else, something heavier, something that could not be undone easily. And for the first time since the lights had flashed on behind her car, Maya understood that this moment would not end quietly. The request came without paperwork, without explanation, and without patience. Officer Harris straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Maya. You're not cooperating, he said, voice louder now, meant to carry. If you continue to resist, we'll have to restrain you. The word hung in the air, restrain, heavy with threat. Maya felt her pulse spike. She had answered every question, followed every instruction, yet the accusation landed as if it were already decided. Maya shook her head slowly, careful not to move too fast. I am cooperating, she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. Her hands were still visible, fingers stiff from the cold. Inside, fear pressed against her ribs. She thought of the countless times she had told patients to stay calm while machines beeped and alarms rang, of how fragile calm could be when power tilted the wrong way. Here, she had no chart, no protocol that could protect her. Ethan stepped forward again, this time not stopping halfway. He placed himself slightly in front of Maya, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth from his jacket. His voice cut through the tension, firm and unmistakably final. That's enough, he said. She's done nothing to justify cuffs. The calm he had carried earlier hardened into something sharper, forged by memory. He knew the signs, the moment when authority stopped listening and started asserting. Harris's eyes flicked toward Keller, then back to Ethan. You need to back away, Harris said. This doesn't involve you. It does now, Ethan replied. He inhaled once, deeply, as if deciding something he had avoided for years. You should know who you're dealing with. I'm a former United States Marine. The words were not spoken with pride, but with weight. I know procedure. I know escalation. and this is wrong. The lot went quiet. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. Keller's expression shifted, surprise flashing across his flushed face before settling into a guarded sneer. Harris's jaw tightened. Ethan continued, because once begun, the truth demanded completion. That dog beside me, Rex, served as a military canine. He's trained to respond to threats, and he's under my command. Ethan's hand rested briefly on Rex's neck, a grounding touch. And this station? This place you're standing on? It's the only thing I kept after I came home. I'm not letting it become a place where people are hurt for no reason. Rex stood unmoving, his breath steady in the cold air. His ears remained forward, eyes locked on the officers. Years of training had etched restraint into his muscles. At nearly 8 years old, his muzzle carried flecks of gray, but his posture was flawless, the posture of an animal who understood control better than most humans. For a fraction of a second, it seemed Harris might hesitate. The admission had changed the equation, but hesitation passed quickly. Harris's expression hardened, his authority challenged too publicly now to retreat. "Turn around," he ordered Maya. "Hands behind your back." Maya's breath caught. "Please," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop it. She looked at Ethan, at Rex, at the small cluster of vehicles now idling at the edge of the lot. She felt exposed, stripped of dignity by a decision she could not influence. Ethan shook his head. "Don't do this," he warned quietly. "You're crossing a line you can't uncross." Harris ignored him. Keller moved in, reaching for Maya's arm. The touch was rougher than necessary, fingers biting into her sleeve. Instinct flared. Maya stiffened, then forced herself to relax, terrified that any resistance would be twisted against her. Cold metal snapped around her wrist. The sound echoed louder than it should have. At that instant, Rex barked. Just once. A single, sharp warning that cracked through the night like a gunshot. It was not rage, not chaos. It was a trained signal, precise and deliberate. Ethan's hand tightened briefly on the collar as he issued a low command, barely audible. Rex froze again, muscles taut but controlled, his bark already fading into silence. The effect was immediate. Heads turned. One of the bystanders, the tall man in the heavy parka, raised his phone fully now. His face was pale, eyes wide, but his hand was steady as the screen lit up. "This is live," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His name was Daniel Price, a long-haul trucker in his early 50s with a weathered face and graying beard. The kind of man who had seen enough of the country to know when something wasn't right. He angled the phone toward the scene, the red recording dot glowing like a warning light. Another phone appeared from a car farther back, held by a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair and a thin frame, her expression tight with concern. She didn't speak, didn't approach, but she didn't look away either. Harris realized it a beat too late. "Turn that off," he snapped, pointing toward Daniel. Daniel swallowed, but he shook his head. "Public place," he said quietly. "I'm not interfering." The situation slipped out of its closed circle then, spilling into something wider and far more dangerous for everyone involved. Maya stood cuffed, wrists burning, humiliation and fear warring inside her. Ethan's jaw was set, eyes dark with a resolve that came from a past he had hoped never to draw on again. Rex remained locked in place, a living reminder that restraint had limits. As the live stream continued, the flashing lights no longer felt like control. They felt like exposure. The night air seemed to hold its breath, and with every passing second, it became clearer that this stop had crossed into territory no one could quietly erase. The first thing that changed was the sound. Not the siren, not the engines, those had been there all along, but the faint, uneven echo of voices carried through cold air. Phones were up now, Screens glowed from inside cars, from behind windshields, from shaking hands that had decided this moment was worth remembering. Maya felt it before she understood it. The pressure in her chest eased slightly, replaced by a sharper awareness. She was no longer alone in the dark with 2 badges and a pair of handcuffs. Eyes were on them. Too many eyes to ignore. Ethan took 1 step forward and stopped. He didn't rush, didn't touch anyone. He simply placed himself between Maya and the officers, feet planted shoulder-width apart. At 42, Ethan Walker still carried himself like a man used to standing his ground. Broad shoulders, weathered face, close-cropped hair flecked with gray, and a jaw that stayed tight even when he said nothing. The scar above his right eyebrow caught the flashing lights, a pale reminder of a roadside blast years ago that had taught him how quickly authority could fail. Rex moved with him, silent and precise. The German Shepherd's body aligned slightly forward, angled toward Maya. Not aggressive, not submissive, protective. His dark coat rippled as muscles shifted beneath, breath slow and controlled. 8 years old, joints stiff in winter, but his training remained absolute. He watched hands. He watched feet. He waited. Officer Keller didn't like the silence. "Back up," he snapped, stepping forward. His voice carried irritation, not command, the kind that came from losing control in front of witnesses. Ethan didn't move. The shove came suddenly. 2 hands to Ethan's chest, sharp and unnecessary. It wasn't procedure. It was frustration. Ethan went down hard, boots sliding on frozen concrete. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, pain flaring through his shoulder. The sound echoed louder than it should have, sharp and final. Maya gasped, instinctively stepping forward before the cuffs yanked her back. Rex surged. The movement was immediate, explosive, driven by instinct and training colliding at once. His body coiled forward, a low growl vibrating through his chest, teeth flashing as his weight shifted. This was the moment his training was designed for, the instant before harm. Time slowed. Ethan, still on one knee, raised his hand. His voice cut through the noise, steady and unmistakable. "Rex." "Down. Hold." The words were clipped, military precise. Rex stopped mid-motion. Muscles trembled, then locked. The growl cut off. He remained alert, eyes fixed on Keller, body forward but frozen. Control reclaimed in a single command, trust proven. Ethan pushed himself up slowly. He didn't rush. He didn't swear. He brushed ice from his jacket, breath steady now, eyes never leaving the officers. He spoke louder this time, not for them alone. "Listen carefully," he said, turning just enough that the phones could catch his face. "If my dog is forced to protect me or that woman, everything from this point on stops being lawful for you." He gestured toward the glowing screens around them. "This is being recorded. Every second." The shift was immediate. Officer Harris's hand hovered near his belt, then dropped. Keller's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the phones, the cars, the growing number of witnesses. Authority drained from his posture, replaced by calculation. From one of the parked cars, a woman stepped forward. Sarah Whitman, late 40s, tall and slender, ash-blonde hair pulled into a practical knot. She wore a wool coat and sensible boots, the uniform of someone who believed in rules because she'd spent her life upholding them quietly. A school librarian by trade, Sarah had learned to recognize moments when silence became permission. She raised her phone and said nothing. "Back up," Harris tried again, but the words lacked weight. Maya's breathing steadied. Fear still burned, but beneath it was something else now. Anger, clarity, and the fragile relief of being seen. Ethan shifted subtly, blocking the officer's view of her wrists without touching her. Rex remained still, eyes bright. waiting for the next command that never came. In the distance, sirens wailed faintly, not close enough to help, close enough to promise consequences. Harris swallowed. "Everyone needs to calm down," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. No one moved. The moment before violence passed, leaving behind a charged silence heavy with implication. The line had been crossed, and everyone, especially the men with badges, knew it. Captain Reynolds arrived without urgency, which was the first tell. His cruiser rolled in slow, lights on but siren silent, as if the night itself owed him patience. He stepped out with the practiced calm of a man used to walking into messes he did not intend to clean, only to contain. Mark Reynolds was in his early 50s, tall, with a squared frame softened by age, salt and pepper hair combed back, a neatly trimmed mustache that made his expressions look gentler than they were. His uniform fit perfectly, creases sharp, boots clean. He smiled the way administrators do, measured, reassuring, empty. The crowd shifted when they saw the rank. Phones tilted higher. Comments surged again. Reynolds took it in at a glance, eyes flicking from Ethan to Rex to Maya's cuffs to the glowing rectangles in the dark. He raised both hands, palms out, the universal gesture of calm. "All right," he said, voice warm and even. "Let's take a breath. Everybody's safe. Nobody needs to make this bigger than it already is." Ethan didn't answer. He stood with his weight evenly distributed, shoulders relaxed but ready, eyes locked on Reynolds' face. Years ago, in a dust-choked village half a world away, he'd learned to read men who smiled while counting exits. Rex mirrored him, still planted, still silent, the tip of his tail barely twitching. Reynolds turned to the officers first, a private nod, a subtle reclaiming of command. "You guys did your job," he said, quietly enough to sound supportive. "We'll sort the rest." Then he faced the phones. "For everyone recording," he added, louder now, "we appreciate civic engagement. But for safety reasons, I'm going to ask that cameras be turned off while we de-escalate." No one moved. Sarah Whitman's phone stayed raised. Her pale face was composed, lips pressed thin. She had spent 20 years teaching children how systems worked, how rules were meant to protect the quiet and the small. Tonight, she recognized a different lesson being offered. Daniel Price nodded once and kept streaming, his hands steadier than before. Reynolds' smile tightened, just a fraction. He pivoted, choosing a different approach. "Ethan," he said, using the name with familiarity that felt rehearsed, "why don't we all head down to the station, get warm, sort this out properly?" Ethan's answer came flat. "No." Reynolds blinked, surprised. "That's not a request," he said gently. "It is," Ethan replied, "because there's no lawful reason for her to go anywhere." He gestured to Maya. "And you know it." Maya lifted her chin. The cuffs were still biting, but her voice was steady now, controlled. "Captain Reynolds," she said, "before you decide anything, you should know two things. First, I am a named witness in an ongoing federal civil rights case. Second, the live stream is archived. Even if every phone here goes dark, the footage exists." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Reynolds' eyes narrowed, the calculation quick and precise. "Ma'am," he said, tone shifting to professional concern, "now is not the place to discuss legal matters." "It became the place when your officers put me in cuffs," Maya replied. She was 28, slim, with deep brown skin that the cold had left ashen at the edges, dark curls pulled back into a tired bun. Her eyes were sharp, despite exhaustion, the eyes of someone who had learned to document everything because memory alone was never believed. Reynolds took a step closer, lowering his voice. "If that's true, your attorney can address it. Let's handle this inside." "My attorney has been notified," Maya said. "She's on her way." That landed. Reynolds' jaw tightened, the mask slipping for a breath before it settled again. He glanced at the phones, at the dog, at Ethan. The crowd had grown. Drivers pulled in and didn't leave. The cold no longer discouraged them. He tried once more, this time with authority stripped of warmth. "I'm instructing everyone to disengage. Cameras off. We'll document internally." Ethan laughed once, short and humorless. "Internal documentation is how this disappears." Reynolds' gaze hardened. "Careful." "Already am," Ethan said. Rex shifted his weight, not forward, not back. Present. A promise without a threat. The pressure mounted. Notifications pinged louder. Someone shouted that a local reporter had shared the stream. Another voice said a lawyer was commenting live. Reynolds knew the math. This wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about optics, about minimizing fallout. He turned sharply to the officers. "Remove the cuffs," he ordered. Harris hesitated, then complied. The metal fell away from Maya's wrists, leaving angry red marks. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, grounding herself. Reynolds faced the crowd again. "This stop is concluded," he announced. "Anyone with concerns can file a complaint." The words rang hollow, but they were final. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply retreated, already building the narrative in his head. As he walked back to his cruiser, his phone vibrated. He checked it once, face tightening. Somewhere down the highway, Maya's attorney was closing distance. Somewhere online, the story was spreading beyond his control. The system had arrived to protect itself, and for the first time that night, it was running late. Morning came quietly to Redwood Falls, the kind of pale winter dawn that softened sharp edges without erasing them. Frost glazed the asphalt, and the mountains beyond the highway held their breath as if waiting to see what the town would do next. The gas station lights were still on, humming steadily, unchanged by the night that had tried to break them. By sunrise, the uniforms were gone. The cruisers had rolled away one by one, leaving behind taped markers and a thin perimeter that signaled caution rather than authority. An internal notice went out before breakfast. Temporary suspension for the 2 officers involved, pending review. Evidence preserved, statements collected. The language was careful, designed to promise order without admitting fault. Ethan unlocked the store at 6 sharp, the way he always did. He moved with the quiet economy of habit, broad hands steady as he flipped switches and counted change. The scar above his eyebrow caught the first light through the windows. He hadn't slept much. Old memories had stirred, nights overseas when morning meant inventory of losses. He pushed them down and focused on the small, controllable things. Coffee brewing, shelves aligned. The bell above the door tested once to be sure it still rang. Rex lay down at his usual spot by the entrance, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded. In daylight, the German shepherd looked older, silver threading his muzzle, a stiffness when he shifted. But calm radiated from him. 8 years had taught him the difference between danger and aftermath. He listened to the town wake up, content to guard without spectacle. Across town, a white SUV with a federal plate eased into a municipal lot. Agent Laura Chen stepped out, collar turned up against the cold. She was in her late 30s, slight and sharp, dark hair pulled into a low knot, eyes alert behind rectangular glasses. Years of civil rights work had etched patience into her posture and skepticism into her smile. She didn't rush. She never did. Federal attention moved best when it arrived early and spoke softly. By mid-morning, phones buzzed with updates. A brief statement confirmed an external review. The captain's name appeared with a phrase no administrator wanted attached. Under consideration. The town read it twice, then a third time, as if repetition could make it heavier. Maya returned just after 9. She parked away from the pumps this time, hands steady on the wheel. The marks on her wrists had faded from red to yellowed bruises, tender reminders she refused to hide. She wore a simple coat, hair loose now, curls framing a face that looked tired but resolved. Inside, she paused at the threshold, letting the bell ring once before stepping forward. Ethan looked up and nodded. No speeches, no cameras, just recognition. "You okay?" he asked. Maya took a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I will be," she said. Her voice carried a steadiness she'd earned overnight. Rex lifted his head, tail tapping once against the floor. Maya smiled at him, crouching slightly, careful not to crowd. He sniffed, then settled again, trust established without ceremony. She told Ethan the basics, how her attorney had arrived before dawn, how a federal team had requested copies of the footage, how statements would be taken again with counsel present. She didn't dramatize it. Nurses learned to deliver facts cleanly. "I didn't want to leave without saying this," she added, eyes dropping to the counter before meeting his again. "If you hadn't stepped out, if he hadn't stayed still." She gestured to Rex, then stopped, emotion catching at the edge of her words. "I would have been swallowed by that night." Ethan shook his head once. "You stood your ground," he said. "That matters." Outside, Sarah Whitman walked past on her way to work, wool scarf tucked tight. She slowed when she saw Maya through the window, lifted a hand in a small wave, and kept going. Witnesses, Ethan thought, don't always need a microphone to matter. By noon, Agent Chen arrived at the station. She ordered coffee, paid in cash, and took a seat near the window where she could see the highway. Ethan noticed the way she cataloged the room, exits, reflections, faces, without staring. When she introduced herself, it was brief and precise. She asked for the footage. She asked about the cameras. She asked about the night without asking him to relive it. "This isn't about punishment," she said quietly, as if correcting a common misunderstanding. "It's about pattern." Ethan understood patterns. He nodded. By afternoon, word spread that the review would widen. Procedures examined. Training logs requested. The language shifted again, this time toward accountability. The captain's name appeared in a second notice, longer than the first. As the sun dropped, the gas station filled with ordinary life. A trucker bought coffee. A teenager grabbed chips. Someone asked Ethan if he'd seen the weather report. He answered them all, patient, present, uninterested in praise. Rex stretched and rolled onto his side, belly to the warmth near the door. The day had asked nothing of him beyond watchfulness, and that was enough. Maya stood to leave. She hesitated, then turned back. "I'll be around," she said. "There's more to do." Ethan met her gaze. "I figured." When evening settled, the town felt different. Not healed, not fixed, but awake. Justice hadn't arrived with sirens or speeches. It had arrived with restraint, with records preserved, with a refusal to look away. It had begun when one man stepped out from behind a counter, and one dog stayed exactly where he was told. That night did not end with flashing lights or shouted commands. It ended with something quieter, something closer to a miracle. Not the kind that breaks the sky open, but the kind God places gently in ordinary moments. A man who chose to step forward. A dog trained to stay still when chaos begged him to strike. A woman who refused to surrender her dignity. Sometimes God does not send angels with wings. Sometimes he sends courage disguised as calm, and protection disguised as restraint. In our daily lives, miracles rarely announce themselves. They happen when we choose to do what is right, even when it costs us comfort. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to support stories like this, and may God bless you, protect you, and walk with you, today and always.